They called it a family meeting. No context, no warning. Just a text from my mother on a rainy Tuesday evening. Be at the house Saturday, 3 p.m. Important family matters. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the screen while the steam rose from my untouched tea. The wording was simple. The intention was not. In my family, important matters had always meant the same thing. Someone made a mistake and someone else had to clean it up. Usually, it was my sister. Sometimes, it was my father's silent guilt. But somehow, the cleanup crew was always me. I am Clara. I am 42 years old. I am a clinical psychologist with a quiet practice and an even quieter life. I have spent most of my adult years helping others untangle their emotions, set boundaries, and reclaim self-worth. But here I was, once again, caught in the very web I thought I had outgrown. This wasn't the first family meeting. It wouldn't be the loudest. But something told me this one would be the last. When my aunt passed away a year ago, she left behind a modest inheritance. Nothing extravagant. A home on a hill, a savings account built from years of quiet living, and a letter. The house, the money, the heirlooms. She left them to me. Not out of favoritism, but for a reason she explained in her own words. You are the only one who listens before you speak. You see people as they are, not as they pretend to be. That is why I trust you to protect what I've built. I hadn't told my parents about the full extent of what I'd inherited. I hadn't told my sister. I hadn't told anyone. But somehow, they knew, and now they wanted to discuss what's best for the family. It wasn't hard to guess what they meant. What shocked me was not the request itself. What shocked me was how calmly they delivered it, as if it was obvious, as if what was mine should have always belonged to them. That day, something quiet inside me shifted. I wasn't angry. I wasn't defensive. I was simply done. And in that silence, a very different kind of strength began to rise. My name is Clara Monroe. I live in a small, craftsman-style home on the edge of Portland, Oregon, where the rain falls more often than it doesn't, and silence is something you can hear. I've always preferred quiet, not because I fear noise, but because I know the weight of words, and how easily they can be used to wound. I am 42, unmarried, and by most external accounts, successful. I run a private psychotherapy practice focused on trauma recovery and family systems. People trust me with the parts of themselves they don't know how to carry, and somehow they often leave lighter. That has always been the goal. But my own family, that's a different story. My parents, Helen and Raymond Monroe, are the kind of couple who look perfect from a distance. Churchgoers, long marriage, a well-maintained home with a white garden swing out front. But behind closed doors, they measure love in sacrifices and tally them like debts owed. My younger sister, Elise, is 39. Brilliant, passionate, and volatile. She was the wild one, the free spirit, the artist. She has never held a steady job, never finished college, and never once been asked to be responsible for anything. And yet, somehow, she's always been the center of everything. When Elise fell behind on rent, I was the one who covered it. When she crashed her car, I helped her replace it. When she spiraled after yet another failed relationship, I was the one who stayed on the phone until dawn. That was the dynamic. Elise lived. I managed. And my parents, in the name of fairness, always expected me to be the steady one. You're the strong one, Clara, they would say. Elise just needs more support right now. They said that in our teens. They said it in our 20s. They were still saying it last year, when Aunt Margaret passed and left everything to me. My aunt had been my quiet refuge growing up. A librarian. A single woman with a garden and a shelf full of books on philosophy and world religions. She never said much, but what she said mattered. She saw me in a way no one else in my family ever had. When she died, she left me her home, her estate, and a handwritten note that read, "Do not mistake keeping the peace for keeping your soul intact." I had honored her wishes. I had followed every legal step, but what I hadn't expected was how quickly the whispers began. How quickly it should be shared turned into, "You're being selfish." Now, standing on the edge of yet another family meeting, I realized something important. They weren't going to stop asking, but I had finally stopped saying yes. It started with a casual phone call, the kind that pretends to be about weather and weekend plans, but is really a prelude to something heavier. "Hey, sweetheart," my mother said, her voice syrupy sweet. "How's the clinic? You seeing any new clients? I gave her a vague answer. Something about referrals and reschedules, and waited. I knew better than to fill the silence. Sure enough, it came. Your father and I were thinking, she began, maybe it's time we talk about Aunt Margaret's estate. You know, what's best for the family. There it was. No pretense, no hesitation, just an assumption. What do you mean exactly? I asked, already knowing, but I wanted to hear her say it. Well, she continued, you know Elise has been having a rough go of it. She's still between apartments, and with her gallery closed, she's barely keeping up. It's not her fault. The art world is so unstable these days. And? I asked, my tone carefully neutral. And we thought maybe it makes sense to move things around, put the inheritance into a shared family trust. That way, everyone can benefit. It's not fair for one person to hold it all when we're all struggling, is it? I could hear the clink of dishes in the background. She was likely drying plates, pretending this conversation was just a mild suggestion over house chores. But I heard what she didn't say. What she meant was, you're stable. Elise is not. Therefore you owe her, and worse, they believed it. She left it to me, I said quietly, specifically, not as a placeholder, not to be redistributed. She loved you both, my mother said quickly. I'm sure she didn't mean for her legacy to cause resentment or division. It took every bit of professional restraint I had not to respond like a therapist. Instead, I replied as a daughter who had spent decades swallowing resentment like medicine. I think what causes resentment is expecting someone to give up what they were trusted with just to make everyone else feel more comfortable. There was a long pause on the line. Then she exhaled sharply. Well, she said, the sweetness gone. We'll talk more about this at the family meeting. Saturday at 3. Elise will be there too. And just like that, it became an appointment, a performance. They would gather, make their case, maybe raise voices, maybe cry, maybe throw words like guilt, fairness, loyalty. But I already knew this wasn't a discussion. This was a request for surrender. Later that evening, I stood in front of the mirror, brushing my hair back into a loose bun. I looked at myself, not the therapist, not the daughter, just the woman who had been given a gift and now stood at the edge of losing it, not through law, but through obligation. It was in that moment I made the decision. Not just about the assets, about the boundaries. I would go to that meeting, but I wouldn't go to explain myself. I would go to draw a line. Saturday arrived with gray skies and a hush in the air, like the world was holding its breath. I pulled into my parents' driveway 10 minutes early, just enough time to steady myself, not long enough to give them the upper hand. Their house hadn't changed since I was a teenager. Same beige siding, same worn, welcome mat. The flower pots out front overflowed with petunias, carefully tended by my mother, as though blossoms could distract from deeper cracks. I sat in the car a moment longer, watching as Elisa's battered Volkswagen rolled in behind me. She stepped out in oversized sunglasses and a denim jacket a size too big, cigarette already lit despite the no smoking sign my parents still hung near the porch. "Hey," she said, walking toward me. "You look therapist-y." I smiled faintly. "You look like you haven't slept." She shrugged. "I haven't. Art show closed early. Rent's late. You know, the usual." I nodded. We didn't hug. Inside, the house was already staged. Dad sat in his usual armchair, newspaper folded in his lap, but he wasn't reading. Mom busied herself at the kitchen island, laying out coffee cups and a plate of shortbread, like this was a friendly catch-up instead of what it was. "Clara, sweetheart," she said, too brightly. "Come sit. I made your favorite." I took the seat furthest from my father. Elise flopped onto the couch and kicked off her boots, already restless. The performance began. "So," my dad said, clearing his throat, "we wanted to talk about Margaret's estate. Not Aunt Margaret, just Margaret, as if the title of family had suddenly become inconvenient. "Yes," I said, folding my hands in my lap. "You mentioned wanting to create a trust." Elise sat up, crossing her legs. "It's not a big deal, Clara. You still get to manage it. We just think it'd be more fair if the assets were shared." "More helpful," Mom corrected, gently. "Elise is between places. Your father's retirement fund has taken some hits. This would ease everyone's burdens." I looked at the three of them. Their voices were calm, reasonable. Their eyes said something else. Desperation, expectation, entitlement. I reached into my bag and placed a folder on the coffee table. Inside were the finalized documents, the deed transfer, the new account titles, the irrevocable trust agreement. Everything Aunt Margaret had left me, now fully protected. I anticipated this meeting, I said quietly, so I've already secured the estate in my name. It's not just mine by sentiment, it's mine by law. There was a pause, a ripple of tension in the room, like the first tremor before an earthquake. My mother's smile faltered. My father sat up straighter. Elise laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You're joking," she said. "You locked it all up, without even talking to us?" "I'm talking to you now," I said, still calm. "You've always been so selfish," my mother whispered, her voice low with accusation. "No," I said, "I've always been quiet. That's not the same thing." The room fell silent again. I had come prepared, not for a fight, but for a stand, and I wasn't moving. The silence didn't last long. Elise shot up from the couch, sunglasses now pushed back into her tangled hair, eyes red-rimmed and sharp. "You think just because you have paperwork, it makes you right?" she said, pacing now. "You always hide behind rules and signatures. You're so obsessed with control, you don't see what's happening around you." I didn't respond. I just watched her. Years of therapy had taught me that sometimes silence was the loudest response. But she wasn't finished. "You don't even need the money," she snapped. "You've got your practice, your tidy little life. This was never about fairness. You just wanted to win." Dad cleared his throat, a sound I'd come to associate with power plays. He was shifting tactics. His voice softened, almost paternal. "Clara, sweetheart, no one's trying to take anything away from you. We just think Margaret wouldn't want this inheritance to tear the family apart." There it was, the guilt card. Always the guilt card. I met his gaze. "And yet you waited until now, until after everything was finalized, to try to talk about fairness. Why is that?" My mother chimed in before he could answer. "We assumed you'd want to do the right thing. Share with your sister. Help your parents. Is that so unreasonable?" "Help?" I asked, my voice firmer now. "Or fix?" My mother blinked. "Because I've been helping for years, paying off Elise's credit cards, covering her rent, making donations to your church fundraisers when the mortgage was tight, quietly, without question. And now that someone finally left something just for me, you call it selfish to keep it?" "It's not about the money," Elise hissed, arms crossed. "It's about family." "No," I said. "It's always been about the money." The moment I said no, it became about morality. My father stood now, tall and quiet in his way. "You don't know the whole story. Elise is an adult," I interrupted. "She's an adult who has made choices I've paid for, and I'm done." The room pulsed with heat. No one spoke. Then Elise, voice brittle but quieter, asked, "So that's it? You're cutting us off?" I looked at her, really looked. Beneath the anger was panic, fear, the kind that comes when the usual lifeline is pulled away. "I'm not cutting anyone off," I said, "but I am setting boundaries. The inheritance is not a lifeline. It's not a bailout fund. It's a legacy Aunt Margaret trusted me with, and I'll protect it." Mom sat heavily in her chair, her hands trembling slightly. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper. "She always liked you best." "No," I said gently. She saw me clearly. That's not the same thing. The tension in the room had shifted now, not gone, but softened, like steam after a boil. My family had expected resistance, maybe a negotiation. What they hadn't expected was resolve, and as I gathered my things to leave, my mother asked softly, "What happens now?" I paused at the door. "Now?" I said. "Now you decide how you want to be part of my life, knowing I won't sacrifice myself to be part of yours." I stepped into the gray Portland afternoon, the chill air washing over me like clarity. I wasn't angry anymore, just free. The wind picked up as I walked back to my car, stirring the dried leaves along the sidewalk like restless memories. I paused for a moment, hand on the driver's side door, and looked back at the house I'd once called home. For a long time, that place had meant obedience, quiet endurance, and a simmering silence. But today, it meant something else entirely, a turning point. As I drove through the quiet streets, my thoughts drifted to Aunt Margaret. She had been the wild branch in our carefully pruned family tree. Never married, no children of her own, and unapologetically eccentric. While my parents taught me manners and modesty, Margaret taught me independence and curiosity. On my 16th birthday, she gave me a battered first edition of The Feminine Mystique and said, "You don't need to ask permission to be who you are." She wasn't affectionate in the traditional sense, no gushy cards or smothering hugs, but she listened. She remembered the names of my friends, asked about my interests, and always spoke to me like an equal. I remembered visiting her old Victorian house on the edge of town, its overgrown garden, the smell of old paper and cinnamon tea, the cluttered walls covered in strange art and antique clocks. I used to sit cross-legged on her floor as she read aloud from books that weren't meant for kids. Philosophy, poetry, economics. "You've got more sense than that whole family combined," she'd say with a wink. "You'll have to protect that." And I did. Or I tried to. After I left for college, Margaret and I kept in touch through letters, long, handwritten notes where she'd muse about politics, neighbors, or the best way to make buttermilk biscuits. When I came home from grad school, exhausted and unsure of myself, she was the one who said, "Start small, start honest, don't let anyone talk you out of your own knowing." In the last year of her life, I visited often. Cancer had thinned her hair and made her bones brittle, but her mind stayed sharp. She hated the hospital gowns, refused to use a walker, and insisted on fresh flowers in every room, even if they made her sneeze. One night, shortly before she passed, she took my hand and said something I still carry with me. "They'll come for what I leave you," she whispered. "Not because they need it, but because they believe they're entitled to it. You must protect it. But more than that, you must protect yourself." She didn't mean just the money. She meant the space I had carved in the world, the work I had done to build a life that didn't revolve around other people's crises, the freedom to say no without guilt. And so I had. I remembered sitting at my kitchen table, weeks after her funeral, reading the will with Calvin, her lawyer and longtime friend. The room was quiet, except for the soft turning of paper. "She wanted you to have everything," he said simply. "The house, the accounts, the collection." She was very specific. My fingers had trembled as I signed the documents. Not out of greed, out of weight, responsibility. She hadn't just handed me an inheritance. She had handed me a mission to preserve not just the assets, but the intention, to protect not just the house or money, but the spirit of independence it represented. Now, months later, I finally understood what she had seen all those years ago, and I finally understood what she meant when she said, "They'll try to talk you out of your own knowing." But I hadn't let them. Not this time. It wasn't over. The confrontation had passed, the declarations had been made, but something still sat uneasily in my chest, like a riddle left unsolved. My family had always been demanding, yes, entitled certainly, but something about this latest attempt felt desperate. Too desperate. That night, I lay awake in bed, replaying every word, every expression, every silence between sentences. Elise's rage had been expected, my mother's manipulative grief, predictable. But my father? There was something else in his eyes, something he hadn't said. The next morning, I called Calvin. "I need you to check something for me," I said. "Is there any indication that my parents or Elise tried to access Aunt Margaret's estate or accounts before the meeting?" There was a pause, a subtle intake of breath. "Clara, yes," he said carefully. "Actually, we flagged some irregular activity last week. Someone requested information using your aunt's old POA. Years expired. The bank notified us. We were in the process of investigating." My blood ran cold. "Do you know who?" "From the metadata, it appears the request came from your father's office." I closed my eyes. Of course it had. "But why?" I whispered. Calvin continued, "I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but if you're asking me now, it sounds like you've sensed something too." I hung up shortly after and sat at my kitchen table, fingers drumming the wood. The pieces began to fall into place. It wasn't just about helping Elise. It wasn't just about fairness or family legacy. There was something they hadn't told me, something they needed to fix, quickly and quietly. 2 hours later, I found myself parked in front of a low brick building downtown. My parents' longtime accountant, Gerald, had an office tucked between a dental clinic and a shuttered florist. I hadn't seen him in years. but I remembered he used to give me lollipops and tell awkward jokes about tax returns. I walked in without an appointment. "Clara Monroe?" he said, standing with visible hesitation. "Is something wrong?" "I need answers, Gerald," I said, voice calm but unwavering, "and I think you know what I'm here to ask." He motioned for me to sit and close the door. "What your parents did, it wasn't malicious. They were desperate." I didn't respond. He exhaled and leaned forward. "Your father's business is in serious trouble. Has been for a while. He took out a line of credit against the house last year and defaulted. Your mother's retirement is gone. They've borrowed more than once against fake collateral, including estate assets they don't own." My stomach dropped. "They were counting on your aunt's inheritance to quietly plug the holes," he said, "to pay off debts before the bank noticed. Elisa's situation just gave them cover. So it had never really been about her. Not entirely. They were drowning, and they were hoping I wouldn't notice until after I'd thrown them a life raft." I stood up slowly. "Why didn't they just ask me for help?" Gerald gave a sad smile. "Because they thought you'd say no. And they were right, not because I didn't care, but because I'd done my part for decades. And maybe it was finally their turn to do theirs." As I walked out of that office and into the afternoon sun, I realized the truth was simple, even if the story had been twisted. They hadn't just wanted my inheritance. They needed it, and they were willing to lie to get it. By the time I got home, the air outside had shifted. A low-hanging fog rolled across the street like a curtain being drawn on the second act. The warmth of the day had evaporated, replaced with something colder, quieter, like the moment before a storm. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. Instead, I did what Aunt Margaret had taught me. I took inventory of what I had, of what I knew, of what I needed to protect. That evening, I sat down with my laptop and opened a secure file I hadn't touched since the will was finalized. In it were the full details of the estate, every document, every account, every asset, the savings accounts, the property deed, the heirloom insurance, copies of the letters Margaret had written, scans of the notarized statements she'd made to ensure no one could claim she was coerced, and most importantly, the clause, the one she'd had added near the end of her life, in the event of attempted interference, coercion, or unauthorized access to my estate by any party, I grant the beneficiary full legal right to pursue protective legal recourse, including but not limited to the establishment of an independent trust, revocation of family privileges, and reassignment of any jointly named accounts. She had anticipated this, and now I needed to act on it. The next morning, I called Rachel Lamb, an estate lawyer I had referred clients to over the years, but had never needed for myself. "Clara," she said, after I laid out everything, "you're fortunate. Margaret was incredibly thorough. This clause is ironclad. Can we act on it?" "We already are," she said. "I'll file for protective trust restructuring this afternoon. We'll transfer all remaining estate assets into an irrevocable trust. You'll be the sole grantor and beneficiary, and it will be legally separate from your family. We'll also flag the prior access attempts as part of the documentation." "And if they try to contest it?" I asked. "They can try," she said, her voice calm and certain, "but it will be expensive, public, and ultimately futile. I'll also request an injunction to prohibit further access attempts. You'll have full legal backing to protect every inch of what's yours." I felt something loosen in my chest, something heavy that had sat there for years, not just because the law was on my side, but because, for once, I wasn't waiting for the next blow. I was the one taking action. By the end of that week, the trust had been filed, the property had been redeeded under its protection, the remaining accounts were ternary trod. I received confirmation that the estate was now fully insulated from outside claims, past, present, and future. And then I wrote the letter to my parents, to Elise, not out of vengeance but out of clarity. It was 3 pages long, direct, unemotional. I explained what had been done, what protections were now in place, and what their attempted interference had triggered. "I am not severing ties," I wrote in the final paragraph, "but I am severing access. You are still my family, but you are no longer entitled to what does not belong to you. If you wish to repair trust, it must begin with honesty, and it must begin without expectations." I printed the letters, sealed them, and mailed them that Friday. No return address, only my name, and one line typed in clean black ink at the bottom of each envelope. I know what you tried to do, and it ends here. The silence didn't last long. By Monday afternoon, the phone calls started. First from my mother, 6 missed calls in a row, then Elise, then a voicemail from my father, calm on the surface, but laced with quiet fury beneath. Clara, we got your letter. I don't understand what you're right? This wasn't meant to be hostile. We were just trying to have a conversation. Call us back. I didn't. On Tuesday, they showed up at my office. I was in the middle of a session when my receptionist buzzed through. There's a Richard and Helen Monroe here. They say it's urgent. I closed my eyes and exhaled slowly. Tell them I'm with a client, and I won't be available the rest of the day. I waited. Clara, she said again, more softly. They're refusing to leave. Of course they were. I walked out into the waiting room 5 minutes later. My mother stood the moment she saw me. My father remained seated, arms crossed, jaw clenched. You could have just talked to us, she said immediately. You didn't have to go behind our backs. I didn't go behind your backs, I said evenly. I acted after you went behind mine. She blinked, caught off guard. I know about the bank access, the outdated power of attorney, the accountant. I know about the debts, the mortgage, the lies. My father's eyes narrowed. You don't know the full picture. You're right, I said. I don't. Because you never trusted me enough to give it to me. You tried to manipulate me instead. My mother's voice rose. That inheritance was meant for all of us. Margaret would have wanted it shared. No, I said firmly. She didn't. She made that very clear. And more importantly, you didn't come to me with a request. You came with a plan already decided, assuming I'd follow along. That's not a conversation. That's a demand dressed up as tradition. She's your sister, my father added sharply. And I'm your daughter, I replied. But neither of you seemed interested in what this would cost me. He stood now, slow and deliberate. You think we're the villains, that we're greedy. But what you don't understand is that families fall apart when people put money before people. No, I said, eyes locked on his. Families fall apart when people pretend that love is entitlement, when people assume forgiveness is automatic, and that generosity has no limit. There was a pause, long, loaded. You've changed, my mother said quietly, not with admiration, with disappointment. You're cold now, hard. No, I said again. I'm clear. She looked like she might cry. My father looked like he might yell. Instead, they both left. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilt watching them go. Later that night, Elise called. I let it go to voicemail again, but this time, I listened. I'm not going to beg, she said, her voice clipped and tired. But I will say this. I'm drowning. I've made a mess. A big one. And maybe I don't deserve anything from you. But I didn't ask for this situation. They did. They assumed. And now everything's broken, including us. There was a pause, and then softer. I don't want your money, Clara. I want to know if we can still be sisters. I sat with that for a long time, because the truth was, I didn't know I'd spent years being the glue, the one who smoothed things over, who gave too much and asked for too little. And now I wasn't smoothing anymore. I wasn't giving to stop the bleeding. I was setting the bone properly, knowing it would hurt first, but heal stronger. The confrontation had happened. The fallout was real, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like my life was mine. No longer up for grabs, no longer on the table, and finally, not for sale. The days that followed felt strange, quiet, but not in the peaceful way, more like the quiet after an earthquake, when everything is still standing, but nothing feels quite stable yet. I went about my routines, work, grocery shopping, emails, but something in me had shifted. The boundaries were real now, visible like fences where there used to be open fields. I didn't hear from my parents again that week, but I did hear from Elise. This time, she didn't leave a voicemail. She sent a letter. It was handwritten, something rare in a world of texts and emails. The envelope was plain, the handwriting shaky but familiar. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly in half. Clara, you don't owe me anything. Not your time, not your trust, not even this letter, but I owe you honesty. I've spent my life hiding behind other people's decisions, mom and dad's, mostly, letting them clean things up, make the hard calls, be the villains, so I didn't have to be anything at all. But I see it now. That wasn't survival, that was avoidance. You've always been the one who did the work. I resented that, not because you made me feel small, but because you reminded me that I could have done more, too. I don't know what comes next. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I understand why you did what you did, and I don't blame you for protecting what Margaret gave you, because it was never just money. It was trust, and you honored it. I hope one day I can be someone who deserves to be part of that legacy, too. Elise. I read it 3 times. Then I folded it and put it in the same box where I kept Margaret's letters. That weekend, I drove up to the cabin. The air was crisp and the trees were beginning to turn. Margaret had always said autumn was the best time to reflect. The trees let go of what they no longer need, she'd once told me. And they're beautiful doing it. I spent the afternoon on the porch, wrapped in a wool blanket, sipping tea from the same mug Margaret used every morning. I let my thoughts wander, not just about what had happened, but about what might come next. Could I forgive Elise? Could I rebuild trust with my parents? Did I even want to? Those were questions that didn't need immediate answers. For now, it was enough to know I had choices, that my life was no longer being shaped by obligation and guilt, but by intention. That night, I started drafting my own letter, not to them, to myself, a kind of manifesto, a reminder for future me, in case old patterns ever tried to sneak back in. It began simply. I am not responsible for fixing what others break. I am not required to set myself on fire to keep others warm. I am allowed to protect peace. I am allowed to say no. I am allowed to be the heir of love, not just legacy. I signed it, dated it, and tucked it away, because some promises, the most important ones, are the ones we make to ourselves. And in the silence of the mountain night, with only the sound of wind rustling the trees, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Steady, not happy, not victorious, not even at peace, quite yet, but grounded and ready for whatever came next. 3 months later, I hosted Thanksgiving at the cabin. It wasn't a grand gesture, not an olive branch, exactly, more like an open door, with clear terms. I invited Elise, not my parents, not yet. The guest list was small. Veronica, her partner James, my neighbor from the valley who helped me fix the porch stairs last winter, and Elise. She arrived late, car pulling up the gravel driveway just as I was basting the turkey. I saw her silhouette through the kitchen window, hesitating at the edge of the porch. A pie dish clutched nervously in both hands. I met her at the door. "Pumpkin," she said, holding it out like an offering. "From scratch. Kind of a miracle." "I'll believe it when I taste it," I smiled, stepping aside. Inside, the cabin was warm, lit by firelight, scented with rosemary and cinnamon, filled with the quiet hum of voices and the clink of dishes. She looked around like she was entering a sacred place. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's Margaret's," I said. "I just look after it now." We didn't talk much during dinner. There wasn't pressure to. She sat across from me, beside Veronica, laughing softly at James's dry humor, eating slowly, carefully, as if the meal itself was some sort of fragile test she didn't want to fail. After dessert, after the guests had trickled out, and after the last wine glasses were rinsed and turned upside down on the drying rack, we sat on the porch. No script, no plan, just stars above the tree line and the hush of late November. "You didn't have to invite me," Elise said. "I know." "Why did you?" I took a breath. "Because of your letter, because you told the truth, and because I'm trying to believe that people can change, not just say they want to." She nodded, looking down at her hands. "I've been going to therapy," she said after a moment. "I'm not very good at it yet, but I'm trying to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be liked or rescued." I turned to face her more fully. "You don't have to be perfect here," I said. "Just real." She smiled, small, tired, but real. "There's so much I wish I could undo." "You can't," I said gently, "but you can stop carrying it forward." That night, she slept in the guest room, the same room where Margaret used to keep quilts she'd sewn by hand, the room that smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. Before I went to bed, I stood outside the door for a moment, listening to Elise's quiet breathing, and I thought about how grief and healing often occupy the same house. Thanksgiving passed. Christmas came. And then, one morning in January, I got a letter from my parents. Not a legal one, a real one. My mother's handwriting on the envelope. It was 5 pages long. Parts of it were difficult to read, not because of the words, but because of the effort they clearly cost. Apologies, explanations, a kind of halting, fragile honesty, and something else, a request, not for money, not for access, but for a meeting. Just coffee, it said, somewhere public, neutral ground, no expectations, just conversation. I haven't replied yet. I'm not rushing, because part of healing, I've learned, is accepting that time is not the enemy. It's the space in which we decide what we're willing to carry and what we finally choose to put down. 2 weeks later, I said yes. We met at a quiet cafe on the east side of town, the kind of place with soft jazz playing in the background and tiny vases of fresh flowers on each table. I arrived early and chose a seat by the window. I needed light. I needed space. When my parents walked in, they looked older, not just in years, in posture, in energy. My father's hair, once thick and commanding, had thinned considerably. My mother's expression, once tightly composed, now carried an edge of uncertainty, like they knew they were stepping into something fragile. They didn't hug me. I didn't expect them to. We nodded, sat down. The silence stretched for a beat too long. "I didn't think you'd come," my mother said first. "I almost didn't," I replied. "But I'm here, so let's not waste it." My father cleared his throat. "Clara, we've had a lot of time to think about everything." He looked directly at me. "We were wrong. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't defensive. It was just quiet. You were right to do what you did. Margaret trusted you for a reason, and we failed to see that." I held my coffee cup between both hands, letting the warmth ground me. "We didn't respect the boundaries you were trying to set," my mother added. "We only saw what we wanted." I nodded. "You treated my inheritance like a backup plan, not as something that represented someone else's life, someone who mattered to me." They both lowered their eyes. "I'm not here for an apology," I continued. "I'm not even here to rehash what happened. I'm here to be clear. I'm not angry anymore, but I am changed. And I'm not going to step back into the role you've always assigned me." My mother's voice broke a little. "We know. That's why we asked to meet here, to say we accept that. We want a relationship, but only if you want one too." That stopped me. Not because I hadn't hoped for it, but because I hadn't expected them to say it out loud. I looked out the window. Snow had begun to fall, soft and slow, blanketing the world in quiet. "I want something real," I said finally. "Not perfect, not performative, just honest, with boundaries, with time." My father nodded. "Then that's what we'll give. We'll follow your lead." We sat there a while longer. The conversation moved to smaller things. Weather, Elise, books. Nothing deep, nothing forced. When we stood to leave, my mother reached into her bag and handed me a small envelope. I hesitated. "It's not a check," she said, a trace of humor returning to her voice. I opened it when I got home. Inside was a photograph. Me and Margaret on the porch of the cabin, both of us laughing, holding mugs of tea. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, "She trusted you. We're learning to do the same." I sat with that photo for a long time, because sometimes trust isn't about erasing the past. It's about choosing to build something new, one quiet, steady step at a time. Spring arrived slowly in the mountains, as if winter was reluctant to loosen its grip. But one morning in late April, I woke to birdsong and sunlight pouring through the cabin's east windows. The snow had melted. The earth smelled alive again. I stood barefoot on the porch, mug of chamomile in hand, and let the moment wash over me. It had been almost a year since that family meeting, the one where everything unraveled and everything began. So much had changed. Elise still called every Thursday. She was seeing a therapist regularly, holding a part-time job at a local bookstore, and had even started painting again, not for galleries, not for approval, just for herself. She mailed me a small canvas last month. Abstract, quiet. She titled it, Repair. It now hangs in the hallway between the guest room and the kitchen. My parents hadn't returned to their old habits. Not entirely. We weren't close in the way some families are. But there was something softer between us now. More space for honesty, more willingness to pause. We were still learning each other in this new arrangement, still unlearning a lifetime of roles. But the important thing was, we were trying. One afternoon, my father sent me a package. Inside was a bound folder with carefully labeled tabs, financial disclosures, estate plans, health directives. A note sat on top. We don't want you to be surprised or responsible for cleaning up our messes. This time, we're doing it right. It wasn't just paperwork. It was an offering, a small act of repair, but the greatest change was in me. I no longer flinched when my phone buzzed with a family name. I no longer rehearsed justifications for every boundary I set, and I no longer believed that being needed was the same as being loved. That distinction changed everything. One Saturday, I held a small gathering at the cabin. Nothing formal, just a few friends, Elise and my parents. Everyone brought something: homemade bread, a bottle of wine, stories. We sat outside under the trees, fire pit crackling, the stars starting to blink awake. At one point, Elise stood and raised her glass. "I want to thank Clara," she said, her voice trembling just slightly. "Not for saving me, she didn't. She refused to. And that saved me more than anything." There was a silence then, not awkward, but full. My mother took my hand, gently. My father nodded, and I understood something I hadn't before. This inheritance, Margaret's cabin, her investments, her wisdom, was never just about assets. It was about learning to value what you preserve. Not just things, but yourself. Margaret had given me more than a house and a trust. She'd given me the blueprint for dignity, for legacy, for a life lived with intention, and I had finally built it. Brick by quiet brick. That night, long after the others had gone home, I stood alone on the porch, looking out into the dark trees. I thought of Margaret, of the strength in her silence, the clarity in her choices, and I whispered the words I never got to say. I did it. I kept what mattered. I didn't let them take it from me. Not this time. The wind rustled in the trees, like a reply. I went inside, lit the candle in the library window, the one Margaret always lit when someone in the family was traveling. It flickered there, soft and steady, a signal, a homecoming, and maybe, just maybe, a beginning.